Cologne, early 1948. Ashtrays loaded, rain ticking on glass. A British colonel slides a folder across the walnut while Detroit smoke makes its own ceiling. Inside, a factory. Tools, drawings, an entire town built around an assembly line. I think what we're being offered here is worth a damn. Paper clicks shut. The free factory stays on the table. Why, he's sure. Detroit will build 500,000 cars this year. Wolfsburg has bombed roofs, scavenged wiring. A pre-war people's car British engineers called not first-class design. The gap looks fatal. What Breach doesn't know. Within 7 years, that junk asset celebrates its millionth car. Painted gold, cameras popping. By October 1949, 10,000 workers, 4,000 cars monthly, 30 million marks in the bank. The switch isn't crung. It's June 20th, 1948. New currency, abolished rationing, shop windows filling overnight. 21 million marks in exports follow. Trust becomes possible. Production becomes inevitable. How does a free write-off become a rival? To understand how wrong they were, you have to go back 3 years earlier, to the day a British engineer walked into ruins and saw something else. August 1945. The ruins were noisy if you knew where to listen. A British major named Ivan Hirst walked into a plant that had been built as a promise and used as a bunker. Windows punched out by shockwaves, wiring scavenged for heat, a phantom line of cars that stopped the day the sirens went quiet. Hirst took a lamp and that wry patience engineers borrow from their tools. He kicked aside chalky glass and pulled a tarpaulin off a pre-war prototype. More suggestion than car. The body looked like a shrug. The guts were stubborn metal, still true. He got the generator humming. He got the jigs to answer their names. He found the shapes that make a chassis when you hold them in the right order. A visiting British industrialist took one look at the blown windows and scavenged wiring and told Hirst, "If you think you'll ever get cars built here, you're a bloody fool, young man." The line aged as badly as the dust. A military government needed wheels more than pride. 20,000 cars, the order said. Basic saloons to move policemen, clerks, mail, meat. 20,000 is not a number you conjure from rubble, unless you plan to use every favor and every scrap. But Hirst didn't argue with arithmetic. He found a store of paint and had the body shells coated the color of something cheerful. He scrounged door handles from one shed and rubber from another, and turned a factory floor into a map of little rescues. When the first engines coughed in chorus, the echo told him this wasn't nostalgia. It was transport. He believed in transport. He believed in the arithmetic of repetition. He believed in things you can count, rolling out the gate and onto a road. The British order did what orders do. It gave strangers a shared clock. German machinists came back through the gates with old lanyards and new faces. A foreman carried his measuring stick like a promise and called the tolerance by sight. Hirst signed requisitions and asked favors of brigadiers and learned which sheds in which towns still had bolts in crates that hadn't been found by night. A lorry brought in a crate of tail lamps from a supplier with no roof. A trainee drew a neat beetle in the coal dust with his boot and laughed at his own private joke. The line began to move in a way that could be timed. While the factory found its gate, the experts did what experts do. British engineers, invited to test and pronounce, took the new old cars to a runway and listened with the hoods up. They logged marks on clipboards. They liked a few details, frowned at a few more, and reached for the safety of cool language. Not to be regarded as an example of first-class modern design to be copied by the British industry, their report concluded. The sentence wore a tie. It would age badly. Summer of 1947. The plant could see past the military order. The tools were still too few, and the parts sometimes had to be persuaded with a mallet. But the rhythm had settled, and there was a man from the Netherlands with a notebook and a face made for deals sealed with coffee. Ben Pon, importer by trade and temperament, put his hand on a finished car as if he were taking a pulse. He'd come for something to sell, in a country that had lost more bridges than he cared to count. He did the arithmetic right there on the floor. The price wasn't good. The car wasn't pretty. But it was honest. and it started. He asked about export papers. He asked about delivery. He asked if someone could spare the ink for stamps. October 1947. He led the first 6 cars toward the Dutch border, where a customs officer with a neat stamp gave each one a little thud of permission. 6 is a small number, unless it's the first. 56 by New Year's Eve. A trickle of hard currency you could count by the clatter in a drawer. Across the channel, none of this moved the needle in the rooms where needles were meant to move. British manufacturers had been sounded out. You could have the plant if you wanted it. You could take the risk and the overhead and the headaches with the tools. No thanks, they said, politely. A pre-war people's car looked like a promise to a planner and a problem to a board. The market was rationed. The roads were tired. The plastics weren't ready. There are 1,000 reasons to be sensible if you're already busy. Sensible can be a trap. By winter, Hirst was running 2 clocks at once. One ticked for the occupation, where cars meant mail sacks didn't sit overnight and patrols didn't walk 6 miles. The other ticked for something he didn't name in memos, but felt in the soles of his feet when he walked the line. A normal world, with invoices and petty complaints and one-day delays that felt offensive because they assumed you had a tomorrow. He'd pick up a chalk and draw the day's tally on a pillar because numbers like to be seen when they're small. But by early 1948, the factory had a problem bigger than any blown window or missing part. The problem was Germany itself. Germany's problem wasn't that it couldn't work. It was that work didn't count. Money was a rumor, ration cards a ritual, cigarettes the reserve currency you paid in whispers. Warehouses had goods they didn't want to sell because price controls made honesty expensive. The black market wasn't a shadow, it was the sun. Everything bent toward it. Everyone looked tired in the same way. And then, on a Sunday morning, everything changed. June 20th, 1948. Strangers in uniform took bundles of new banknotes out of secret rooms and stacked them in offices where the blinds stayed down. The old money retired by decree. The new money arrived in strict amounts and quiet envelopes. The signs that said no stock were taken down by shopkeepers who had the stock all along and had been waiting, not for permission, but for arithmetic to make sense again. 5 days later, June 24th, the Economic Council's Guiding Principles Law, drafted in secret before the currency swap, stripped most price ceilings from daily life. It was published that same day and signed off by the Allied Board on June 25th. The man behind it was Ludwig Erhard, an economist with convictions sharper than caution. General Lucius D. Clay, the American military governor, pulled him aside. "My advisors tell me what you have done is a very bad mistake." Erhard didn't flinch. Pay no attention to them. When a US officer asked him about rationing, Erhard put it even plainer. "I did not relax rationing. I abolished it." Within a week, shop windows refilled. The black market that had been the sun began to shrink. Shelves filled in a day, like a symphony that had been queuing in silence. June 20th and 21st, 1948. A line manager at Wolfsburg stood at the edge of the floor and listened to the sound budgeteers love. A product leaving the building and not coming back for a fix. A very young American economist named Edward Tenenbaum had designed the mechanics of the currency reform. He was 26 years old. Trust is older than paper, but paper helps. Hirst could hear the difference in footfalls. When a worker knew what his pay would buy, he walked differently. When a supplier knew he would be paid in something that wouldn't turn into a bad joke next Tuesday, he shipped. When an export office counted dollars instead of IOUs, they stopped apologizing in their letters. A machine that had been making cars to fulfill an order started making cars to fulfill a world. The factory needed more than momentum now. It needed someone who understood what repetition could become. End of 1947. The British administrators looked for someone to turn repetition into a culture. They found Heinrich Nordhoff, once of Opel, a man with a tidy desk and an intolerance for ornament. He walked the aisles and picked up a part with 2 fingers, like a doctor taking a pulse. He didn't want a new model. He wanted the same model done properly. No flares, no fin. He wanted bolts torqued the same way in the morning and in the afternoon. without mood. He wanted suppliers who did not surprise him. He wanted the price that a clerk in Stockholm and a student in Zurich could understand without a translator. A car is a habit, you said, without saying it. Teach the habit, protect the habit, then sell the habit everywhere. The habit paid back faster than anyone in Cologne's boardrooms had guessed. Through 1948, the plant doubled its output against the previous year. Exports that had fit in 2 columns now needed a ledger, and the foreign exchange office stamped receipts until the ink pad went pale. 21 million Deutschemarks came in via Beetles, crossing borders that had reopened. That's what a correction of judgment sounds like when it goes through a bank.
The factory had learnt to keep its head down when the policy weather shifted. For months there had been lists of removals, factories to be dismantled like clocks by edict and shipped off as reparations. The lists were long. The street politics were loud. In the Ruhr and in places where the word work had always just meant steel, there were protests and stone throwing when the lorries rolled. Wolfsburg watched the wind. It was not a steel mill. It made things people used every day. It made things that made exports. And exports changed the balance sheets that changed the cables sent to London and Washington. That was the kind of arithmetic even men with doubts could love.
October 8th, 1949. The British returns the plant to German hands. Colonel Charles Radcliffe signs the handover protocol under Ordinance 202. The state of Lower Saxony took the keys. The trusteeship ended, with handshakes and careful smiles. The speeches were careful. They mentioned partnership. They thanked the British for stewardship. They nodded to the need for responsibility and restraint. The translators hardly had any work to do. The photographs show 2 men shaking hands in front of a car that had learned to mind its own business. The balance sheet under the speeches was no longer a rumor. Roughly 10,000 people on the payroll. About 4,000 vehicles leaving the plant each month. Cash on hand in the neighborhood of 30 million Deutschmarks. For the full year that followed, the factory recorded 46,154 cars produced. Sales revenue of 243 million marks. A profit a shade under 4 million. Numbers like these end debates without raising their voice. Around them, a plant that once took orders was learning to write them. In London, the argument moved on to other debts, other shortages, other lists. But the lists in Wolfsburg were now made by purchasing departments and shippers, and those lists had a more cheerful music. November 22nd, 1949. A larger agreement in a pale villa on the river, the Petersburg Agreement, codified the end of the most aggressive dismantlings. The sentence for the crime of making things was commuted to time served. The first time Nordhoff said no to a flashy improvement, he was called stubborn. The 10th time, they called it a strategy. He cut where you didn't see and spent where you did, on reliability, on parts that fit in the dark. He trained dealers to treat a complaint as exactly the thing that earns you your next sale. He liked the car the way a craftsman likes a template, for its discipline, not its romance. The romance happened anyway, on roads far from Wolfsburg, where a small car that started in January and in July and in bad rain sold itself to people who thought they didn't buy stories. The Dutch importer came back, of course. He'd filled his book with little sketches, as if drawings could bend steel. One day, in April 1947, in a yard where the factory's own workers moved parts with a crude flatbed on a Beetle chassis, he drew the outline of a box with a driver up front like a ship's pilot. It took a couple of years and a good many arguments, but in March of 1950, the new thing rolled off the line in series, a van that looked like a smile, a merchant's best friend, a postman's favorite. Products keep their promises to cities. A city will notice. March 1950. A new line starts. The importer who had sketched it 3 years earlier stops by and does not say, "I told you so," because he doesn't need to. You can say, "I told you so," with invoices. Towns begin to recognize the moving box with the friendly face. It parks near markets. It carries loaves and ladders and instruments. It is the car that teaches a city to do more of what cities do when they forgive one another. And in the office upstairs, A man compares last March with this March and finds that the comparison is a plot twist. By the end of that year, 1 car in 3 coming out of Wolfsburg was bound for a dock. 18 countries on the order book. Scandinavia, the Low Countries, Switzerland, places where reliability was a kind of weather. The maps in the export office looked like they'd been drawn with a steady hand. The tone in letters from buyers changed from "could we" to "when exactly," and then "more please." A product that had been a punchline was now a currency. It bought parts, it bought goodwill, it bought the right to stop listening to experts who couldn't hear the sound a queue makes when it begins to move. The arithmetic internalizes the moral. You sell more when you stop apologizing for being able to sell. There were still men who didn't like being wrong. Some of them kept their counsel. Some changed the subject. A few insisted that the numbers were an anomaly, a quirk of post-war taste, a fad in sensible shoes. It is hard to argue with a ledger that loves you. It is harder to argue with a queue. Somewhere on a highway outside Brussels, a driver adjusted his seat and decided he liked the strange little car more with every kilometer. When a thing works, its shape becomes inevitable. Then it becomes contagious. The boardroom in Cologne does not appear in the story again. It doesn't need to. Its judgment sits there, dated and on company letterhead, next to a sales curve that makes its own weather. Across the Atlantic, where station wagons taught Sunday how to smell like candy, a black and white advert with a small photograph and a big slice of white space would one day make people who loved size admit, privately at first, that cleverness is a size too. But that comes later. Right now, the proof is simpler and closer. A factory once offered for free is booking orders it can't fill by Friday. A plant that started the year as a ward of the occupation ends it as a partner in a market. If you were one of the British administrators who had stared down the lists and weighed who would be allowed to make what, you could find a way to take credit. You could say that returning the plant was sound policy, an early recognition that you can't guard a fence forever. You could point to the exports and say, see, hard currency, these things pay for themselves if you let them. You could say this with a straight face because, technically, it was true. The story would still be about what you couldn't imagine in that early 1948 room. A junk asset becoming a juggernaut. There is a small, satisfying cruelty in watching the world prove a line wrong. Not worth a damn, said the line that opened this story. It isn't necessary to hear the apology. Better is the color photograph of a car painted gold and wearing a number with 6 zeros. Better is the mundane. A pay stub that buys groceries. A train timetable that runs on Tuesday. A mechanic who no longer keeps a drawer for special money because the normal kind works again. There is a thing that happens to places after a long shortage. People relearn errands. A woman puts on a coat and buys a present because she wants to, rather than because someone finally had boots in her size. A baker buys flour for tomorrow because he trusts tomorrow to be there. A factory manager posts a notice about a social club dance because he understands what a clock is for. Trust is a habit too, and habits spread. The British report that said this wasn't first-class design did not foresee that markets favor good enough, that shows up over excellent, that writes a thesis. It did not foresee that dealership networks count more than arguments. It did not make room for the possibility that a car could be better because 1 million people had found it exactly, easily repairable. Good enough, over and over, beats beautiful, once. The bar chart at the end of the year loves a car that starts every morning. It votes in Deutschmarks. It votes in letters from distributors. It votes in that sound a showroom door makes when someone opens it because their neighbor just bought one and didn't stop talking about it. An engineer can love a beautiful failure like a poet loves a bad marriage. The company that survives loves an ugly winner because payroll is due on Thursday. In Wolfsburg, payroll was due on Thursday and met on Thursday. And with every Thursday, the joke aged into a warning. Be careful how confidently you speak about the future when a young major with a lamp is walking into a building you've already condemned. Men like Breach trained their instincts on scale and style and precedent. And they weren't fools. They were simply busy. Busy can make you blind to the quiet math on factory floors where habit meets incentive. If you want to understand a transformation, you don't go to the speeches. You go to the desk where a woman writes down a chassis number and flips the calendar page. You go to the cash office when the week's exchange slips arrive and everybody relaxes the exact same way. You stand at a border and watch the customs stamp a document, because that sound writes the future in ink. There are many ways to lose. One of them looks like not being hungry enough to see a meal in a seed. In Cologne, in that early 1948 room, the men who could have owned a rival for the price of transport decided their plates were full. Across a continent that still smelled of wet brick, a major with a lamp and a manager with a plan, and a very young economist with a blueprint for trust did the opposite. They took small bites. They chewed. They swallowed. They made the habit of doing that until habits became graphs. You do not need to romanticize a factory to respect it. The work is noisy and regular. It is nicked thumbs and grease under fingernails and a rubber stamp that needs more ink. It is the shift whistle and the lunch pail and the joke that repairs an afternoon. It is boring on purpose, so that nothing important is. It is the sort of place where you learn the difference between what people say about value and what value does when it's bored of being discussed. August 1955. The millionth car wears gold paint because symbolism likes to take photographs. It rolls slowly, like a king making a point by not hurrying. Cameras pop. Workers grin in a way that doesn't need translation, because reaching a round number is human, even when the number's tale of zeros scares you a little. The car is a ceremony for what men in other rooms called policy. The car doesn't know that. It knows a road. It knows a key. It knows a buyer already in a showroom with cash. Numbers make policy real. Policy pays you back by becoming a number that makes you smile. There is a quiet kindness in the ending of this story. The people who were wrong were not punished by thunderbolts. They were punished by the sight of something they could have owned. Everywhere. They saw it parked outside bakeries. They saw it in their neighbors' driveways. They saw it at petrol stations. They read small adverts that made fun of big cars and they laughed, and then bought one anyway. They saw a van with a face that delivered packages to their door. They saw the gold car in a magazine. The apology writes itself in daily life. And the people who were right didn't need statues. They had payroll. They had futures. They had the sound of a factory settling into itself at night, when the last shift leaves, and the building sighs, because it has done what buildings like that want, taken metal and work, and made something that leaves by the front gate under its own power. That's not romance. That's the trick. The boardroom sentence sits there in its frame. The car drives by the window.